Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Life had become a series of monotonous moments of starvation and boredom, interspersed by shelling from the Chetniks on the hills surrounding us and the bombs falling from the sky. They controlled the borders and there was no aid coming in or out. I had become used to the cramps in my stomach, but my mind hungered for a respite from my life. My only escape was the pages of a book, and the only books were from the school library. Before the bombing, Emir and his friends regularly raided the library and exchanged books. I was the recipient of his generosity, but I grew bored with reading his books. When I had planned my raid, I'd been excited about doing something daring, like my big brother. Now that I was standing in front of my former school, all I could think about was my life before the war. I wanted to scream at the stupid girl I used to be, the one who had spent hours counting down the minutes until the end of the school day. Now, what I wanted most in the world was to be an ordinary schoolgirl and have a regular, mundane day.
Amra Pajalic is an award-winning Australian author, educator and indie publisher. Her work explores themes of identity, belonging and resilience, often drawing on her Bosnian background. Amra won the 2009 Melbourne Prize for Literature's Civic Choice Award for her debut novel, The Good Daughter. The anthology she co-edited, Growing Up Muslim in Australia, was shortlisted for the 2015 Children's Book Council of the Year Awards, and her memoir, Things Nobody Knows About Me, was shortlisted for the 2020 National Biography Award. Today I'm talking to Amra Pajalic about her new novel, Time Kneels Between Mountains. Amra, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Bosnia, or Bosnia-Herzegovina, is a part of your heritage, a country formerly known as part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Tell me about your connection to Bosnia.
So my parents are both Bosnian. They migrated here. My mum in 1969, my father a little bit earlier, and they met here. And I grew up thinking of myself as Yugoslav. That's what we were at that time. And then, later the war happened. But I actually lived in what was Yugoslavia between 1985 and 1989. So I was 8 to 12 years old. So I actually lived through what was Yugoslavia at that time, went to school, learned Latinica and Cyrillica, learned to read, write and speak. I can still read, write and speak, but I'm stuck at a primary school level. So when I make an effort to engage with reading or watching media in Bosnian, I can. But since then, as a result of the war, my whole family on my mother's side had to leave what was their town. It was called Bosanska Gradiška. It still exists. It just now belongs to Republika Srpska. So they had to leave their homes. My husband is also of Bosnian origin and he is from Sarajevo. His family survived the siege of Sarajevo for 4 years. He left because he was going to be conscripted into the war at that time. He just finished his national service. So he lived as a refugee in Austria until he came to Australia on a refugee visa. And so as a result of the war, it's really made me want to reconnect with my heritage and find out the history of Bosnia and find out, my origins in a sense. Because when it was Yugoslavia, there was a lot of things that were submerged a little bit under the communist ethos and under the brotherhood ethos that existed in socialist Yugoslavia at that time.
Let's talk about the Balkans. It's an ethnically complex area with a long history of occupation by just about everyone you care to name. How has history shaped this place and its ethnic diversity?
Well, initially, all of it were independent kingdoms. They were independent countries during medieval times. So Bosnia was independent, as was Serbia. And then the first waves of Ottoman occupation occurred. And so within that occupation, Bosnia and Serbia became Muslims. So there was over 250 years of conversion. There's different theories about why those conversions happened, which were there was a Bosnian church that was separate, that was viewed as heretic. There was benefits to be gained by converting. And then after the Ottoman Empire ended, nearly 400 years later, there was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There was World War I and World War II, where it was being carved up in different ways. And then what we now understand as Yugoslavia actually came into existence after World War II. So during World War II, oh my gosh, the research and trying to understand what was happening is just a jumbled mess. We had different sides fighting with the Axis powers. We had the partisans. So there was a lot going on. And so when that war ended, Josip Broz, or who's also called as Tito, established Yugoslavia, which is, means South Slavs, and joined all of the areas at that time into republics. So there were 6 republics, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, and then there were others also. So they were republics until he died in 1980. Communism started falling apart. There were debts coming into action. There was huge economic upset. And we know that at those times, people are looking for a way to make sense of it, to find a better life. And so that's when nationalist propaganda entered that space. And that's when all of the former republics sought independence. And that's when the war that we now know as the Balkan War, or the Bosnian War of 1992 to 1995 occurred, which is as each former republic sought its own independence. There was a fight between Serbia and Bosnia. Serbia wanted to take Bosnia as its own country and make it part of their territory. And so that was sort of the genesis of the war, the background of the war, and now the establishment of these independent countries.
The story begins in war-ravaged and besieged town of Srebrenica in the early 1990s with the Torlak family. The Torlak family are Muslim. What are the challenges facing this Muslim family at this time and in Srebrenica in particular?
Well, I wanted to tell the story of Yugoslavia, which is the fact that before this war, there were people who were, Yugoslavs who did not follow any religion or did not even think of themselves as, Serb or Muslim, etc. And so that is the Torlak family. They live next door to the Jokic family, who are Serb. And as a lot of people did at that time, they would celebrate holidays together, celebrate Ramadan, celebrate the Orthodox Easter and Christmas. There was no sort of differentiation between religion. The fathers saw themselves as best friends, loved each other more than brothers. And Zora, who is Seka's best friend, they just saw each other as best friends. And then as this nationalist propaganda began and the war machine began, there was discrimination, there was othering, there was tension, and there was pressure put on by the Serb government for all the Serbian citizens of Srebrenica to leave. So there were skirmishes between, who was holding the town, and first it was the Serbs, then it was the Bosnians. But in the end, it was the Bosnian Muslims becoming besieged in the town. It's a town that is surrounded by mountains, so it's completely isolated. And so that created its own difficulties in terms of survival. And that's one of the stories I wanted to tell through this family. I really wanted to show the challenges of survival, but also that broader story of Yugoslavia and of the way that survival changes and challenges who they are.
Your story is told through the voice of Seka Torlak. What are the challenges facing someone like Seka?
So the challenge is just being a young girl growing up at that time, going through adolescence, friendship issues, crushes, boredom, seeking intellectual stimulation. But then there are also the broader challenges of being in a besieged town during war, fighting for survival, not having enough food, trying to have some sort of a life and some sort of normality in a very abnormal situation. So it was trying to tell the story of a young girl in a war zone. What is that like, in order to humanize the reality of what happens at that time? And it's just something I was personally interested in. It was like a creative challenge to recreate what it might have been like for a young girl, a young teenage girl, to imagine myself in some ways in this situation. And just the tensions that also occur within the family, the changes that each person in the family experiences and the way that they transform.
The Torlak family are compelled to take in two refugees, Edina and her son Ramo. What does this mean for the Torlak family, and Seka in particular?
So for Seka, she sees Ramo as someone who is close to her age, is only 1 year older. So it's an opportunity for companionship, but it's complicated by the fact that Ramo has his own experiences of the war. And because he has lost family, he has certain prejudices against Serbs at that time. And so she's drawn to him and she wants to have a friendship. And then there's also the aspect of being two young teens in a war with no one else who is their age. So just wanting to do the regular things that teens want to do. And there is that teenage crush that occurs. There's all sorts of things happening in terms of the war zone, wanting to do things that teenagers do, which is, go out, have fun, but there are the challenges of being in a war zone and always needing to be aware of the fact that they are being shot at and shelled at every time.
That was one of the really eye-opening aspects of this book, the spectrum of attitudes between various ethnic groups and warring factions. Seka's apparent fair-mindedness, in her opinion, of Serbs, for example, suggests that attitudes can be quite different depending on individual experience.
That was something that I discovered through my research when I was reading first-person accounts about how a lot of people had been friends with neighbours, with Serbs that they worked with, and they didn't think of them as anything different. They were all Yugoslav. But then when the war occurred and they started losing family and they started losing their freedom, their liberty, their lives, it was very hard to hold on to that humanity. And so I really wanted to show how Seka was fighting to hold on to that humanity, to not judge every single person on the other side as, a killer or as the enemy. But the fact that when you are actually besieged and you are in that situation of constant terror, it is very hard to hold on to those principles, and it is very hard to see the goodness in people. So that was something that I was struck by when I was reading all of those first-person testimonies, and I really wanted to explore that through Seka so that people could think about it for themselves.
This story explores trauma, the trauma of war, obviously, but also things like corruption. And that's something that confronts Seka early in the story.
She is confronted with the fact that in this town, there are people who have access to resources. They are the ones who, when the aid arrives from the international organizations, they have access to it. And there is corruption where they are taking that aid to help feed their families. While there are other people, like those who came from the villages who don't have any connections, who are struggling to survive, who barely get access to any aid at all. There was great deprivation, there was starvation, mass starvation of people. And so she is someone who is drawn to trying to find justice in this unjust situation. And through her story, I just also wanted to sort of show the complexity of war, that we have the one people, Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks, as we call them, in this town of Srebrenica, who are besieged by Serb forces. In this town, there is also this division and there is also this friction. And so it's also showing what happens when you are under pressure like that it's not just fighting to retain humanity in terms of the enemy, but just fighting to retain humanity in general toward any other person, because every single day is a fight for survival. As a result of the genocide that occurred on the 11th of July, 1995, when 8,372 men and boys were murdered and buried in mass graves, the Srebrenica that I write about that exists there right now, most of the population have left and very few have returned. It belongs to Republika Srpska, so it now belongs to the enemy, and there is a cemetery and a place of remembrance where all of the victims, they're trying to find them and bury them. But what was Srebrenica, and that Srebrenica that existed during Yugoslavia that we start the book with, doesn't exist anymore by the end of the book, and it doesn't exist now.
There's also an Australian connection running through this story. It begins with an Australian journalist named Alyssa. What does far off Australia represent for Seka?
So for Seka, Alyssa Jones is first an opportunity at a meal ticket. By helping a journalist, it means that she gets much needed resources and money to be able to buy food for her family. But then later, it's an opportunity to find justice, because Alyssa is someone who is wanting to investigate the reality of what is occurring in this corruption. And then she's also, in a sense, the hope for a future outside of Srebrenica once the war ends, and something that Seka is striving towards and is giving her hope during these 4 years that she is under siege.
Time Nails Between Mountains falls into the genre of historical fiction, but it's also a page-turning thriller, but not easy reading in that it doesn't turn away from the brutal realities of the war. Its violence, including the deaths of women and children, genocide, suicide, racism and rape, even abortion. What does fictionalizing such acts contribute to our comprehension of this war, or perhaps of any war?
Through fiction, we have the opportunity to learn. Writing this book was learning about history. But then in order to be able to share that and sort of recreate it, I had to create the characters and take the reader through the whole experience. And so fiction also really tells stories that can't be told anymore, because there aren't that many survivors that survived the Srebrenica war. The women who did survive, they are the ones that need to tell the stories. And so that's why I chose to tell the story from the perspective of a female survivor. So for me, it was important to tell that historical fiction story and to really tie it down to the reality of what happened, but also just write a story of fiction, a thriller that people want to read, and also to set it within a genre that people can read this sort of traumatic events and still, like, I love crime fiction. I love reading crime fiction. It helps me work through my own fears, and there is a sense of, understanding and achieving a resolution. And so that's what I wanted to give my readers. I wanted to give them the opportunity to learn, but just to enjoy a story and feel that sense of resolution through that story.
My final question to you, Amra, is about the title, Time Nails Between Mountains, an enigmatic title, even poetic. What does it say about the story within these pages?
I love this title. Every once in a while, you have just this magical moment where you write a scene. And when I was writing this scene, I didn't even feel like it was me. I felt like this was coming from somewhere. So there's a scene where Ramo and Seka are going to search for wood. It's winter. there is no heat, and in Bosnia it gets really cold and people actually can freeze to death. And so they're up in the mountains searching for wood, and they're having to go further and further each time. And Ramo's looking around the mountains, and there should be a tourist campaign for Srebrenica about the fact that this is a place where time comes and it just kneels and it never gets up. It never moves again because they are frozen in time. And something about that piece of dialogue, I got the title from that. And I thought it's just perfect because it captures that theme of this town and this place that is frozen in time, literally in this scene during winter. Also, because of the siege and the people can't move, they can't go anywhere. One of the most fascinating facts that I found was the fact that they were using money, and the money was being recirculated so many times. It was so worn and threadbare that, it was almost falling apart. And I just thought, oh my gosh, that really shows how they are completely trapped and everything that they have is all they have. And so it captures that theme, that moment for these two teenagers who feel like their youth is passing them by and they're not sure whether they will survive each day, whether they will get to live past this war. It just felt like a gift. It felt like a gift from the muse who just came and tapped me and gave me this beautiful scene and this amazing title.
Amra Pajalic, thank you so much for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me to talk about this book.
I've been talking to Amra Pajalic about her new book, Time Kneels Between Mountains. It's published by Pashukin Press, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.